In the quiet, dusty town of Whisper Hollow, a 19-year-old girl, Lottie, is sold by her preacher father to a lonely widower, Cole. Bound by a past filled with pain, Lottie must navigate a life she never chose, while facing the haunting presence of a man from her past, Burke Kincaid, who believes Lottie belongs to him. But as secrets unravel and unexpected bonds form, Lottie finds herself on a journey of self-discovery, healing, and a chance at redemption. Will she find the strength to reclaim her life, or will the shadows of her past keep her trapped? What would you do if you were in Lottie's shoes? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next chapter of this thrilling journey. Whisper Hollow had seen better days, but those days seemed to slip further away with each passing season. The town, dry and worn by time, stood like a ghost of the past. Dirt streets crisscrossed through rows of dilapidated homes, and broken fences lined yards where children once played, but now there were only whispers. Whispers that followed everyone's steps, carried by the wind, twisting around corners, and vanishing into the dry air. On this day, the whispers were louder than usual. The town square had gathered a small crowd, all eyes focused on the scene before them. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement, and Lottie stood in the center, barefoot and trembling. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her breath came in quick, shallow bursts. Lottie, just 19 years old, had arrived in Whisper Hollow 3 years ago, a quiet girl with downcast eyes, a past she kept hidden behind closed lips, and a body marked by scars. The people of the town speculated about her. Some said she was cursed, others thought her mute, and a few whispered about a fire that had ruined her life and left her with a permanent limp. But none of them knew the truth. None of them knew what had led to this moment. Her father, a preacher whose faith had long since withered, stood beside her, his expression devoid of emotion. He had always been cold, distant, and now he was offering her up to the highest bidder. "Cole Hunter," the auctioneer called, his voice flat as he addressed the crowd, a stranger in the town. The man who stood before Lottie was a stark contrast to the preacher. He was a man of few words, hardened by his own losses. At 36, Cole had buried his wife and son beneath the same cottonwood tree that now overlooked his small plot of land. The weight of his past pressed heavily on him, and now it was time to add another burden. For a mere $19, Lottie was sold. No warmth, no kindness. Her father handed her over without even meeting her gaze, his hand still gripping the money as he turned and walked away. The crowd parted, and Cole stepped forward. His hand brushed against Lottie's arm, cold and stiff. She didn't look up, but her hands shook. She had never felt so alone, so forsaken. Her life had been reduced to this, nothing more than a price tag, a commodity to be bartered for. "Come on," Cole's voice was low, rough, as he gently led her away from the crowd. The whispers followed them, but neither of them acknowledged them. It was as if they were both invisible in this town that offered no refuge. The town of Whisper Hollow felt colder as Cole led Lottie toward his small cabin on the outskirts of town. The wooden planks creaked under their feet as they walked, and the only sound was the soft rustle of the wind, the occasional bark of a dog in the distance. Neither of them spoke as they moved toward the house, the weight of the silent agreement hanging between them. Lottie's heart was a tangled mess of confusion and fear. She had spent so many years running from her past, trying to hide the truth of what had happened to her. She had kept to herself, never making friends, never letting anyone get too close. The scars, both physical and emotional, were too much for anyone to understand. And yet, now she was here. Sold. Taken by a man who seemed just as lost as she was. Cole had no words of comfort for her. No promises. His silence matched hers. Neither of them knew what to say, what to do. This was the beginning of something neither of them wanted, and yet it was happening. Cole's small cabin was nothing like the life Lottie had imagined. It was weathered and worn, the walls covered in the dust of years gone by. The roof sagged in places, the windows cracked and streaked with grime. But in a strange way, it felt like home in the emptiness that surrounded them. At least, it did for Cole. Lottie stood by the door, unsure of where to go or what to do. She had been taken into this man's life without any choice. She couldn't escape the fate that had been forced upon her. She looked around, noticing the small details. The half-filled woodpile outside, the barren land stretching far beyond the cabin, the graves beneath the cottonwood tree that stood nearby. "You'll stay here," Cole said, breaking the silence. His voice was gruff, like he was unused to speaking to anyone. "I'll bring in some food later. There's water, a bed." His words were simple, but they carried a weight of finality. "You'll be safe here." Lottie didn't answer, but she nodded silently. Safe. The word felt like a lie in her mouth. How could she feel safe when she didn't even know the man standing before her? She wasn't sure if she could ever feel safe again. That night, Lottie lay in the bed Cole had given her, staring at the ceiling as the sounds of the night filled the room. She could hear the distant howls of wolves, the rustle of the trees outside, but most of all, she could hear the whispering of the townspeople that she had left behind. The rumors about her past. They followed her like shadows. In the morning, she stepped outside, hoping for a moment of peace. But the town was still there, watching from a distance. Some nodded in acknowledgement, others turned away quickly, but all of them whispered. They whispered about her father, about the fire, about the tragedy that had brought her to this moment. "Is she really deaf?" someone muttered. "She was cursed, you know." "That's what they say," another voice added, louder this time. Lottie stiffened, but she didn't turn around. She couldn't bear the thought of confronting them, not after everything she had already lost. The whispers stung, but she had learned long ago that the only way to survive was to ignore them, to pretend they didn't exist. But Cole didn't ignore the whispers. As he passed through the town, he could feel the weight of the townspeople's eyes on him. He could hear their questions, their judgments. He had always kept to himself, always stayed out of the town's gossip, but now that Lottie was with him, everything had changed. Some townspeople watched with suspicion, others with curiosity. But there were those who looked at them with disdain. A widow and a girl bought and sold like cattle. They didn't understand. They didn't know the kind of pain that both of them carried. The burden of loss, the weight of a past that wouldn't let them go. The days that followed were silent, filled with the soft creaking of the cabin and the occasional whistle of the wind outside. Lottie and Cole had settled into a routine, though it was an unspoken one. There were no shared meals, no conversations about the future. Instead, they existed beside each other, silent and distant, as if both of them were waiting for something. Perhaps waiting for a reason to speak, to break the tension that hung between them. Lottie stayed mostly inside, cleaning and organizing the cabin, but her mind was always elsewhere, drifting back to the rumors, to the life she had left behind. Each time she stepped outside, she could feel the eyes of the town on her, their gazes heavy with judgment. Some days, she wondered if they even remembered her father or if they only remembered the girl who had arrived 3 years ago, broken and silent, hiding from the past. On one of these quiet mornings, Cole came into the cabin, his boots crunching against the dirt floor. He carried a small bundle of firewood in his arms, and his face was set in its usual mask of indifference. But there was something different in his eyes, something that hinted at the vulnerability beneath the hard exterior he wore. "I'm going to town today," he said gruffly. "You need anything?" Lottie didn't answer immediately. The thought of being alone here in the cabin, of hearing only the whispers in her mind, made her stomach churn. "I'm fine," she muttered, glancing at him for a moment before looking away. Cole studied her, his brow furrowed as if he were trying to understand what was going on behind her eyes. But he didn't press her. "I'll be back soon," he said, then turned and left the cabin, the door creaking shut behind him. Lottie stood still for a moment, listening to the sound of his footsteps fading into the distance. When the silence settled around her again, she exhaled, as if the air had been thick with the weight of something unspoken. She felt trapped in this place, this life that had been thrust upon her. The walls of the cabin seemed to close in on her with each passing day. The town had its own way of dealing with her. Some were curious, some were hostile, and some simply pretended she wasn't there at all. But no one truly knew her. They only saw what they wanted to see, a girl broken by tragedy, a mute girl, a cursed girl. They didn't know how many times she had tried to escape, how many times she had hoped for someone to pull her from the darkness of her past. They didn't know the truth, and she wasn't ready to share it with them. As she moved toward the window to peer out, she saw Cole walking away from the cabin, his figure small against the vastness of the land. He didn't look back. Lottie didn't know how long she stood there, watching Cole disappear into the distance. Her mind drifted, and for a moment, she thought about following him, stepping out of the cabin and walking into the town. But she didn't move. She couldn't. She had no idea what the town would think if they saw her in the streets. Would they mock her? Would they treat her like an outcast, a lost soul that didn't belong? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of hooves approaching. Lottie stiffened, her body tensing instinctively. She peered out the window once more, but this time, her gaze froze as she saw a figure riding toward the cabin. It was a man, a stranger. His silhouette was unmistakable, and something about his presence sent a chill down her spine. Burke Kincaid. Lottie's heart dropped. She hadn't seen him since the night her father had sold her, but she knew the look in his eyes, the menacing air that surrounded him. He wasn't someone who gave up easily. He'd come for her before, and it seemed he was coming for her again. She didn't know what to do. Panic rose in her chest. Her hands shook as she backed away from the window, her thoughts a blur. She had hoped she would never have to face him again, but here he was, returning to claim her like he had promised. Burke dismounted from his horse, his boots thudding heavily against the earth. His gaze swept over the cabin, his eyes narrowing as they landed on Lottie's window. Lottie's breath caught in her throat. He knew she was here. Before she could react, the door to the cabin creaked open, and she heard Cole's voice call from outside, "Who's there?" Lottie didn't know what to say. She couldn't move, couldn't find her voice. Burke had found her again, and there was no escaping him now. Lottie's heart raced as she heard Cole's voice, steady yet filled with the unspoken tension of what was to come. She stood frozen, barely able to breathe, as Burke Kincaid's boots thudded against the dirt floor outside. She could see his shadow cast against the cabin wall through the small window, and it was enough to make her stomach churn with fear. From the doorway, Cole's voice echoed again, this time more forceful. "What do you want?" Burke stepped forward, his presence dark and oppressive. "I'm here for what's mine," he said, his voice dripping with menace. Lottie could hear the smugness in his tone, the sense of entitlement he wore like a second skin. "You know damn well she isn't yours," Cole replied, his voice rising with restrained anger. Lottie's pulse quickened as she heard the harshness of their exchange. She wanted to scream out, to beg Cole to turn the man away, but no sound came from her mouth. She was paralyzed, caught between her fear of Burke and the strange, unfamiliar trust she had begun to place in Cole. She didn't know if she was strong enough to endure another fight like the one that had led her here, but this time, she didn't want to be silent anymore. Cole's voice grew colder. "I won't let you take her." Burke's laughter echoed in the still air. "You don't have a choice, Hunter," he said with a sneer. "You're in no position to stop me." The tension outside mounted, thick and palpable. Lottie's hands clenched at her sides, nails digging into the rough fabric of her sleeves. She knew that whatever happened next would change everything. Slowly, she stepped toward the door. The idea of standing silently behind the walls of the cabin, waiting for Cole to fight her battles, no longer felt like an option. It was time to face Burke, to face the man who had haunted her past and threatened her future. Her hand reached for the door, and with a sharp breath, she opened it. Cole and Burke stood facing each other, a few feet apart. Burke's cold eyes turned toward her as she stepped outside, her voice faltering but louder than it had been in weeks. "I'm not yours," she said, her words barely above a whisper. For a moment, everything stopped. Burke's eyes widened in surprise, as if he had forgotten she could speak. His expression flickered, but only for an instant. Then, the cruel sneer returned. "You've always been mine, Lottie. Don't fool yourself." Cole stepped between them, his body tense, his posture defensive. "She's not anyone's property," he growled, his eyes locked on Burke's. Lottie, despite the knot in her stomach, felt something inside her shift. It wasn't the fear that had ruled her for so long. It wasn't the passive resignation to being owned or claimed. No, something inside her burned with a quiet fire, the first sign of the woman she had buried deep down inside. She was no longer the frightened girl who had been sold. "This is my life now," she said, her voice steady, though the fear still tugged at her heart. "I've made my choice." Burke looked from Cole to Lottie, his face contorting with rage. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected her to stand up to him. The air between them crackled, the tension thicker than ever, but this time, Lottie wasn't backing down. She didn't know what would happen next, but she was ready to fight for herself, for the first time in a long while. Burke took a step back, his lips curling into a frustrated snarl. "This isn't over, Hunter," he spat, before turning and storming off. "Mark my words, I'll be back." As the sound of Burke's horse faded into the distance, Lottie exhaled shakily. She had faced him. She had spoken her truth. And now, she was free, at least for the moment. Cole turned to her, his face hard but his eyes softening. He didn't say anything at first. Instead, he simply placed a hand on her shoulder, a small gesture of reassurance that meant more than words ever could. "You're not alone," he finally said, his voice low. Lottie looked up at him, a small, tentative smile tugging at the corners of her lips. She didn't know what the future held. But for the first time since she arrived in Whisper Hollow, she felt like there might be a chance for something more than just survival. The days following Burke Kincaid's departure were filled with an uneasy quiet. Though he had left, the threat of his return lingered in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and ominous. Lottie tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the small, new life she and Cole were attempting to build together. The garden outside the cabin was starting to sprout, the sunflowers stretching toward the sky, and the cabin, once cold and barren, was becoming a place that felt more like home. But it wasn't just the land that needed rebuilding, it was their lives. For the first time in years, Lottie felt like she might be able to breathe again, but it was hard to shake the feeling that the calm was temporary. It had been too easy to believe that they could simply move on. That Burke wouldn't return. Cole was quieter than usual these days, his eyes often distant, his mind clearly elsewhere. He had spoken little of his past since Lottie arrived, but it was impossible for her to miss the way the weight of his memories seemed to settle on him in quiet moments. The grief of losing his wife and child had shaped him, defined him in ways Lottie couldn't quite understand. And though she wanted to reach out, to ask him about the pain he carried, she was hesitant, unsure if he was ready to share it. Instead, they worked in silence. They spent the days mending the roof, fixing the fences, and gathering firewood. The evenings were quieter still, the shadows stretching long as they sat by the fire, each of them lost in their thoughts. One evening, as the last remnants of sunlight dipped behind the hills, Lottie stood outside, looking up at the stars. They were bright tonight, scattered across the inky sky like tiny diamonds. She felt a small sense of peace, even in the midst of the uncertainty that clung to her like a second skin. But that peace was shattered by a sound in the distance. The unmistakable thud of hooves on the dirt road. Lottie's breath caught in her throat. She turned quickly, her heart racing. She didn't need to look to know who it was. She could hear the sound of the horse approaching, steady and relentless. It was Burke. She didn't know why he had returned, but there was no mistaking the fury in the air. Her pulse quickened as she stepped inside the cabin, her mind racing. Was Cole prepared? Could he protect her again? Would this time be different? The door creaked open behind her, and Cole appeared in the doorway, his face grim. "It's him," he said, his voice tight with warning. Lottie nodded, her heart pounding. "What does he want?" Cole's jaw tightened as he stepped forward. Whatever he wants, he won't get it. Lottie felt a surge of panic but quickly suppressed it. She had faced him before. She could do it again. "I won't let him take me," she said quietly, her voice filled with a strength she hadn't known she possessed. Cole gave her a quick glance, his eyes softening for a moment, before his usual stoic expression returned. "You don't have to fight this alone." Burke Kincaid's figure loomed in the doorway like a storm on the horizon. The moment he stepped inside the cabin, the temperature seemed to drop. His eyes, cold and calculating, moved from Cole to Lottie, sizing them both up with a predatory gleam. "I warned you," Burke said, his voice low, dangerous. "This isn't over, Hunter. You can't keep what's mine." Cole stood firm, his body tense, blocking Lottie from his view. His eyes never left Burke. "She's not yours," he said, his voice cold but resolute. "She never was." Burke chuckled, a low, guttural sound that sent a shiver down Lottie's spine. "I've given you a warning, Hunter. But if you want to keep playing this game, we can play it." Lottie stepped forward, her voice trembling but steady. "You don't own me, Burke. I'm not your property to take or sell. I'm done with you." Burke's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. He took a step forward, but Cole immediately blocked his path, the space between them charged with an unspoken tension. The two men stood facing each other, their standoff as silent as the night itself. Lottie could feel the weight of the moment, the fear, the anger, and the desire to break free all mixing together inside her. She didn't know how this would end, but she knew she couldn't stay silent anymore. She couldn't let him intimidate her. "I won't let you scare me anymore," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Burke stopped, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. For a moment, there was silence, a tension so thick Lottie could almost taste it. But then Burke sneered, turning toward the door. "You think you're safe here?" he spat. "You won't be for long." With that, he stormed out of the cabin, his footsteps heavy and angry. Lottie didn't move, still standing there, her body frozen with the adrenaline of the encounter. But as the door slammed behind him, she let out a shaky breath, her shoulders relaxing for the first time since he had appeared. Cole turned toward her, his eyes softening. "You did good," he said quietly. Lottie nodded, her heart still racing. "But it's not over, is it?" Cole didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Not yet. But we're ready now. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." For the first time in what felt like forever, Lottie believed him. The following days felt like a fragile calm, the kind of stillness that you could feel in your bones but knew wouldn't last. The tension from Burke's confrontation still lingered, hanging in the air between Cole and Lottie. They worked side by side, their movements synchronized, but the silence between them was thick. Both of them were waiting for Burke to return, waiting for the next storm to hit. Cole had been quieter than usual, his eyes often drifting off as if he were lost in thought. Lottie, though, was beginning to feel a strange shift inside her. The fear that had ruled her for so long was being replaced by something else, a sense of resolve, a quiet determination that she hadn't known she had. She had faced Burke once, and she was willing to face him again, no matter what it took. One evening, as the sky darkened into shades of purple and orange, Lottie found herself standing at the edge of the field, staring out at the land that stretched out before her. The air was cool, the scent of the earth fresh from the day's work. It was the first time in a long while that she felt like she could breathe, like she was free from the invisible chains that had bound her for so many years. But the stillness didn't last. The familiar sound of hooves grew louder in the distance, and Lottie's chest tightened. She didn't have to look to know who it was. She turned quickly, her breath catching in her throat as she saw Cole already moving toward the cabin, his stance tense, his eyes hardening as he saw the figure approaching. Burke Kincaid. Lottie's heart pounded in her chest as she watched Cole step in front of her, his broad back blocking her view of Burke. She wanted to step forward, to face Burke on her own terms, but she stayed still, her mind racing. "You should have stayed away, Burke." Cole's voice was low and controlled, but there was an edge to it that made Lottie shiver. Burke didn't speak at first. His eyes flicked from Cole to Lottie, the faintest sneer curling his lips. "You think you can keep her, Hunter?" he growled. "You think you can just take what's mine?" Cole's body tensed, but his voice remained steady. "She's not yours, Burke. You need to leave." Burke laughed, but it was a cruel, humorless sound. "You've got a lot of fight in you, Hunter. But it won't matter. She's going back with me." Lottie's heart was in her throat, and she couldn't stop herself from stepping forward. "No," she said, her voice clear and firm. "I'm not going anywhere with you." Burke's eyes flicked to her, surprise flashing across his face. For a moment, there was silence. Lottie's words seemed to hang in the air between them. "You're nothing," Burke spat, his face contorting with anger. "You'll never be free." Lottie felt the sting of his words, but she didn't flinch. She stood tall, her hands shaking at her sides, but her voice steady as she met his gaze. "I don't need your permission. I'm free." Cole stepped forward, placing himself between Lottie and Burke. His eyes were hard, his jaw set. "You're done, Burke. Leave." For a long moment, Burke said nothing. His gaze flickered between the two of them, anger and frustration written all over his face. Finally, with a snarl, he turned away, his boots crunching angrily against the dirt as he mounted his horse. "You'll regret this, Hunter," Burke called over his shoulder, his voice filled with venom. Cole didn't move, didn't even glance at Lottie, as Burke rode off into the distance. The tension lingered in the air, but for the first time, Lottie felt like she had won something. She had stood up to him. She had said no. As the sound of Burke's horse faded into the distance, Cole finally turned to Lottie. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held a warmth she hadn't seen before. "You don't have to fight this alone," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Lottie nodded, her breath still heavy, but a small smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. She wasn't alone anymore. She had someone by her side. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of hope. The storm hadn't passed yet, but she was ready for it. She wasn't going to let Burke, or anyone, take her power away again. The days after Burke's departure were filled with an almost unbearable tension, but there was also a quiet sense of something new growing between Lottie and Cole. Though neither of them spoke of it directly, they both knew something had shifted. Lottie no longer felt like an outsider in Cole's world, and Cole had started to let his guard down. Lottie spent more time outside now, helping Cole with the chores around the cabin. They worked side by side, the rhythm of their movements becoming familiar, comforting even. She would find herself stealing glances at him, watching as he worked. His hands rough from years of hard labor, his brow furrowed in concentration. And every time their eyes met, there was a moment of understanding that passed between them. The silence between them no longer felt suffocating. It was a comfortable silence, one that spoke volumes without words. Cole was there for her, in a way that was simple yet profound. He didn't push her to talk about the past, didn't demand explanations for the things she kept buried deep inside. And for the first time, Lottie felt like she could breathe, really breathe, without fear of being judged or rejected. That evening, after a long day of work, the two of them sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange. The air was warm, and the sounds of crickets filled the night. "You know," Cole said, breaking the silence, "I never thought I'd be here like this. With someone." Lottie turned to him, surprised. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, the faintest smile on his lips. "I've been alone for a long time, and I thought that was how it was going to be forever. But then you came, and it's different now." Lottie's chest tightened, and for a moment, she didn't know what to say. She had never expected this, never expected to find a connection with someone, especially after all the years of isolation, of running from everything that hurt. But somehow, with Cole, it felt like she had finally found a place to stop running. "I never thought I'd be here either," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "I didn't know what I was running from. I just knew I had to leave. But now." "Now?" Cole prompted, his voice gentle, encouraging. Lottie hesitated, searching for the right words. "Now, I don't feel so lost anymore." Cole's gaze softened, and for the first time, Lottie saw something in his eyes that was more than just the pain of the past. It was warmth. It was the first time she truly felt like she wasn't alone, that someone else understood the weight of the things they both carried. Without thinking, Lottie reached out, her fingers brushing against his. The touch was tentative at first, but then Cole gently gripped her hand, his fingers curling around hers in a simple gesture that spoke volumes. Neither of them said anything for a while. They didn't need to. The connection between them was clear, even without words. It was more than just survival now. It was about something deeper, something neither of them had ever expected. The next morning, after a peaceful night, Lottie awoke early to the sound of birds chirping outside the cabin. The sun was just beginning to rise, and a soft, golden light filtered through the windows. She sat up, stretching her arms, and glanced toward the door where Cole had gone earlier to check on the firewood. But then, the calm was broken. A horse's distant hooves echoed through the quiet morning, and Lottie's heart dropped. She knew that sound. She recognized the rhythm of the horse's gallop. Burke. Lottie's breath caught in her throat as she rushed to the door. She didn't need to see him to know he was coming. The fear that had once gripped her was returning, spreading through her veins like poison. "Cole!" she shouted, her voice panicked, shaking. He was outside in an instant, his face hardening as he saw her standing in the doorway. He didn't say anything but immediately moved to stand in front of her, blocking her view of the approaching figure. "Stay inside," he ordered quietly, but his voice held a sense of urgency that Lottie hadn't heard before. Lottie didn't argue. She stayed by the door, her heart racing in her chest as she watched the figure of Burke Kincaid slowly approaching. His silhouette was unmistakable as he neared, the glint of his rifle reflecting in the morning light. Cole stepped forward, his back straight and firm. "What do you want, Burke?" Burke didn't answer at first. His gaze lingered on Cole, then shifted to Lottie, standing behind him in the doorway. There was something calculating in his eyes, something cold that sent a chill through her. "You've made a mistake, Hunter," Burke said, his voice thick with menace. "You can't keep her from me. She's mine by right." "No," Cole said firmly, his hand resting on the handle of his gun, his gaze unwavering. "She's not yours. She never was." Burke's lips twisted into a cruel grin. "You think you can stop me? You think she's just going to stand by you?" Lottie's chest tightened as Burke's gaze fell on her. For a moment, it felt like time stood still. His words cut deeper than anything she had heard before, reminding her of the helplessness she had once felt. But this time, something was different. She wasn't the same girl anymore. "I'm not yours," Lottie said, her voice steady, clear, and louder than it had been before. She stepped forward, her gaze meeting Burke's with a defiance that surprised even herself. Burke's smile faltered, just for a second, before he regained his composure. His gaze flicked back to Cole, then to Lottie. "You'll regret this," he hissed. And with that, he turned his horse, kicking it into motion and riding off, disappearing into the distance. Lottie stood there, her heart racing, her hands still trembling from the adrenaline. She felt a mix of fear and relief, but mostly, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: strength. As the sound of hooves faded, Cole turned to her, his eyes soft but filled with a quiet pride. "You were brave." Lottie nodded, the realization settling in her chest. She wasn't afraid anymore. And with Cole by her side, she knew she never would be again. The days after Burke's second departure were shrouded in a tense calm, but one that felt different. There was a new resolve in the air, a sense of power that had grown between Lottie and Cole. They had survived his threats, and though they knew Burke could return again, something had shifted in both of them. The fear had faded, replaced by the strength of shared experience and the quiet but growing bond between them. Lottie began to feel more at home in the cabin than she ever had before. Every corner of the space felt like hers now, every tool she touched, every vegetable she planted, every piece of wood she helped split. It wasn't just Cole's cabin anymore, it was theirs. She felt a sense of ownership over it, not just in terms of the physical space, but in how she had begun to carve out a life for herself here, in this small corner of the world that had once seemed so cold and unwelcoming. Cole, too, had changed. He had grown quieter since Burke's last visit, but there was an unspoken strength in him now, something that came from facing down the past and standing firm. The grief that had always haunted him was still there, buried deep, but it wasn't as suffocating as before. And now, with Lottie by his side, it felt as if he could begin to breathe again. One evening, after a long day of work, Cole and Lottie sat by the fire. The warmth of the flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, and the only sound was the crackling of the burning wood. It was a peaceful, comfortable silence, the kind that spoke of unspoken understanding and connection. But something was different that night. Lottie could feel it in the air, something that hung between them, almost tangible, as if it were waiting for the right moment to surface. She turned toward Cole, her heart beating faster. "You never talk about them," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Cole's brow furrowed, and for a long moment, he didn't answer. He stared into the fire, his fingers absently tracing the rim of his mug. But Lottie didn't push. She had known since the beginning that Cole's past wasn't something he wanted to share. It wasn't that he didn't trust her, it was just that the pain was too raw, too fresh. "My wife, my son," Cole began, his voice thick with emotion. "I never thought I'd get past losing them. It feels like it's been a lifetime, but the weight of it never really goes away." Lottie felt her heart twist at the quiet pain in his words. She wanted to say something, to comfort him, but she knew that words were sometimes insufficient. Instead, she reached across the space between them, her hand brushing against his. Cole's eyes met hers, and for the first time in a long while, she saw something in them, a flicker of something hopeful, something he had buried deep down. He didn't pull away from her touch. Instead, he squeezed her hand gently, a wordless thanks. "You don't have to carry that alone," she said quietly, her voice full of sincerity. "You've got me. We've got each other." There was a long silence, But this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that two people could share when they didn't need to fill the space with words. Finally, Cole nodded, his eyes softening. "I'm starting to believe that," he whispered, his voice barely audible. They sat there in the glow of the fire, the world outside falling silent as the night grew deeper. Neither of them spoke, but there was a quiet understanding between them now. No more walls. No more distance. Days passed, and life in the cabin continued its rhythm, the world outside seeming to fade away. But one afternoon, as Lottie and Cole were working together to repair the fence, something arrived that would pull them back into the reality they had both been trying to escape. A letter. Lottie stood still as she held the small, weathered envelope in her hands. The handwriting was familiar, though it had changed over the years. It was her mother's handwriting. For a moment, Lottie's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't seen her mother in years, not since the day she had been forced to leave. She hadn't heard from her either. But here was this letter, sitting in her hands, as if it had been waiting for the right moment to reach her. "Lottie," Cole said, his voice low. He had come up behind her, his eyes on the letter in her hands. "What is it?" Lottie turned to face him, her fingers trembling as she opened the letter. As she read the words, her chest tightened, and her eyes filled with tears she hadn't expected. "Lottie, my dear, I have tried for so long to find the strength to make things right. I failed you, I failed your father, and most of all, I failed myself. But I can't carry this burden anymore. I have been trying to escape the hold your father has on me for so many years, but I have been too weak. I am sorry. Please come to me. I need to see you one last time. Please, Lottie, come to Georgia. I am waiting for you." The letter was short, but the words hit Lottie like a flood. The past that she had buried so deeply suddenly came rushing back, raw and painful. Her mother's apology, her plea for forgiveness, it all felt so overwhelming. Cole stepped forward, his eyes watching her carefully. "Are you going?" he asked quietly, his voice full of understanding but also concern. Lottie looked down at the letter in her hands, her fingers trembling as she traced the words. Her heart was torn. She had spent so long running from her past, from the pain that her mother had allowed her father to cause. But now, the possibility of closure was within reach. "I don't know," Lottie whispered. "I don't know if I'm ready." Cole placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch warm and reassuring. "You don't have to do it alone." Lottie nodded slowly, the weight of her decision settling in her chest. She didn't know what would come of this, but one thing was clear. Whatever the future held, she wouldn't be facing it alone. The days that followed were filled with a quiet unease, the letter from Lottie's mother weighing heavily on her mind. She could feel it, the pull between her past and her present, the constant tug of unresolved questions, of the life she had left behind. Cole could sense the internal struggle. He'd seen it in her eyes, in the way she sometimes stared into the distance, as if searching for something. He knew it wasn't just a letter. It was the chance for closure, for answers that Lottie had needed for so long. But there was something else, something deeper, the fear of reopening a wound that might never heal. Every day, Lottie would hold the letter, running her fingers over the paper, unsure of how to proceed. Her mind was torn between the desire to find her mother, to hear the words she had longed to hear, and the fear that doing so might shatter the fragile peace she had started to build. Cole didn't pressure her to make a decision. He knew this was her journey, her past to confront, and that no amount of urging could prepare her for what lay ahead. But still, he couldn't help but worry. He had seen how much pain Lottie carried with her, and he feared that facing her mother might bring up things she wasn't ready to confront. One afternoon, as they worked in the garden together, Lottie finally spoke up. "I'm going," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Cole stopped, turning to face her. "Are you sure?" Lottie nodded slowly, her eyes meeting his. "I have to. I need to know. I need to know if I can finally forgive her. If I can understand." The words hung between them, heavy with the weight of everything Lottie had carried for so long. Cole said nothing at first, just watched her, as if trying to understand the depth of what this decision meant. But then, after a long pause, he nodded. "I'll go with you," he said simply. Lottie's eyes widened, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. "You don't have to. This is something I need to do alone." Cole shook his head, a small, reassuring smile on his lips. "You don't have to do it alone. Not anymore." For the first time in a long while, Lottie felt a warmth spread through her chest. She wasn't going alone. She had someone beside her, someone who understood the weight of her past and was willing to walk through it with her. The decision had been made, but the journey ahead felt like an endless road, stretching out before them in the distance. The uncertainty of what they would find, what Lottie would face when she met her mother again, hung in the air like a fog. Cole and Lottie packed lightly, just enough for the road ahead, with the promise that they would face whatever came next together. The town of Whisper Hollow, which had once felt like a prison to Lottie, now seemed so far behind her. Yet, as they rode out, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was leaving something important behind. For Cole, the journey was a quiet one. He didn't speak much, but there was a tension in his shoulders, a weight in his eyes that Lottie could sense. He didn't want to admit it, but part of him feared for her. He feared that the ghosts of her past might consume her, that the confrontation with her mother could break her in ways he couldn't fix. But no matter how much he wanted to shield her from the pain, Cole knew that this was something Lottie had to do on her own terms. She needed to find closure, and he could only be there to support her, not to control the outcome. As they traveled, the landscape began to change. The flat plains of Whisper Hollow gave way to rolling hills, and the air grew warmer with each passing day. The journey was slow, but they made steady progress, stopping in small towns along the way, only to find that their destination, Georgia, was still a long road ahead. Every evening, they set up camp beneath the stars, the fire crackling between them as they sat in comfortable silence. But the quiet was never truly peaceful for Lottie. Every crackling branch in the fire, every whisper of the wind seemed to remind her of the decision she had made. She wasn't sure if she was ready to face the woman who had abandoned her, the woman who had let her go. But each day, the burden of doubt seemed to lift just a little more. With every mile they traveled, Lottie could feel herself becoming stronger, more certain of her path. She wasn't just going to face her mother. She was going to reclaim the part of herself that had been lost. Cole's presence beside her was a constant reminder that she wasn't alone, that she could survive whatever came next. She didn't have to carry everything by herself anymore. The long journey finally came to an end when they arrived at the nursing home where Lottie's mother had been living. The building stood in stark contrast to the desolate landscape they had left behind. It was a small, modest facility, nestled among the trees, and the smell of the flowers in the garden mixed with the faint scent of antiseptic from inside. Lottie stood at the door, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath shallow. Cole was beside her, his hand on the small of her back, a silent promise of support. As they walked inside, Lottie's breath caught in her throat. The sterile smell of the nursing home hit her immediately, and she felt the weight of her decision settle heavily on her chest. Her mother had been here for so long, and yet, it felt like a lifetime had passed since she had seen her. The nurse at the front desk gave them a soft smile, but Lottie barely noticed. All she could think about was what lay ahead. They were led down a hallway, the fluorescent lights above casting a cold glow on the sterile walls. Finally, they arrived at a small room at the end of the hall. The door was open just slightly, and Lottie could see her mother sitting by the window, looking out at the garden, lost in thought. For a moment, Lottie couldn't move. Her legs felt like stone, and her chest tightened with an unfamiliar ache. But then, Cole's steady presence beside her gave her the strength to step forward. They approached the door, and Lottie felt her hands tremble as she reached out, her fingers brushing against the cold handle. She hesitated for just a moment before pushing the door open. Her mother turned slowly at the sound, and for the first time in years, their eyes met. Lottie's heart raced as she stepped into the small room, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. Her mother sat by the window, her frail figure bathed in the soft afternoon light, her hands resting gently in her lap. The years had taken their toll on her, but the recognition in her mother's eyes was unmistakable. For a moment, the room seemed frozen in time. Lottie stood at the doorway, her breath catching in her throat, while her mother slowly turned to face her. There was a flicker of recognition in her eyes, followed by something deeper, something Lottie couldn't quite place. Her mother didn't say a word at first, just stared at her, as if trying to find the daughter she had lost all those years ago. It was Cole who stepped forward first, his presence calm and steady. He gave Lottie a small, reassuring nod, and she felt a surge of strength from his silent support. The world outside this room seemed distant now, irrelevant. Everything had led to this moment. "Mom!" Lottie's voice broke through the silence, low and hesitant. Her mother's eyes softened as she finally spoke, her voice faint, barely above a whisper. "Lottie, I didn't think you would come." Lottie's throat tightened, but she forced herself to step into the room. The words she had rehearsed in her mind seemed to disappear the moment she saw her mother again. She hadn't known what to expect: anger, rejection, even indifference. But instead, all she felt was an overwhelming flood of emotions. Pain, relief, fear, hope. Why? Lottie finally managed to ask, her voice thick with emotion. "Why didn't you protect me? Why did you let him do that to me?" Her mother's face crumpled, the years of regret and sorrow etched deeply in her features. She reached out a trembling hand, her eyes brimming with tears. "I couldn't fight him, Lottie. I was weak. I couldn't stand up to your father, to the way he controlled everything. I wanted to protect you, but I was scared. Scared of him. And in the end, I failed you." Lottie's chest tightened. She had spent so long angry at her mother, at the choices she had made, at the way she had abandoned her when she needed her most. But as she listened to the raw, broken words, the years of pain and abandonment began to shift within her. For the first time in years, Lottie saw her mother not as the woman who had failed her, but as someone who had been trapped in her own fear. Lottie's eyes filled with tears, and she stepped forward, closing the space between them. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Lottie whispered, her voice shaking. "But I want to understand. I need to understand why." Her mother reached for her, her frail hand trembling as she cupped Lottie's face. "I was weak, darling. I couldn't save you, but I've spent every day since then hating myself for it. I tried to write, tried to reach out, but I was too sick, too scared to do anything that might make things right. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know that I love you." Lottie closed her eyes, the weight of her mother's words sinking deep into her heart. She had spent so much of her life running, angry and hurt, but now, in this moment, something shifted within her. She wasn't the scared girl who had been abandoned all those years ago. She had grown, changed. She had learned to fight for herself. "I don't know what will happen next," Lottie said softly, her voice breaking. "But I'm here, and I'm not alone anymore." Her mother's tears spilled over as she nodded, pulling Lottie into a fragile, gentle embrace. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't the closure Lottie had dreamed of, but it was enough. It was a beginning, and that was all she could ask for. Cole stood at the doorway, quietly watching the reunion. His heart ached for Lottie, for the journey she had been on, for the woman she had become. He had never asked for this, never expected to be a part of her past, but in this moment, he realized how deeply he had come to care for her. As the hours passed, Lottie and her mother spoke more, slowly unraveling the tangled threads of their past. There were painful truths, hard confessions, but also moments of understanding and healing. Lottie learned things she hadn't known, pieces of her mother's story that she had never understood. She learned about the fear that had gripped her mother's heart, about the way she had been manipulated, controlled, and ultimately broken by a man who had stolen so much from them both. The woman who had been so weak, so lost, now seemed different to Lottie. She wasn't the monster Lottie had always seen her as. She was human, flawed, scarred, but human. When the time came to leave, Lottie stood in the doorway, one last look at the place that had been both a prison and a sanctuary for her mother. There was no grand farewell, no promises of a perfect future. But there was something new between them, a tentative bond, one that had been rebuilt, piece by piece, over the course of the day. Lottie turned to Cole, who had stood quietly by her side through it all. He hadn't pushed, hadn't forced her to do anything. He had simply been there when she needed him most. And now, as they stood together on the threshold of this new chapter, Lottie knew that whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. Cole smiled at her, his expression soft and reassuring. "Ready to go home?" he asked gently. Lottie nodded, the weight of everything she had carried for so long finally beginning to lift. "Yeah, let's go home." As they walked away, the first real step toward a new life together, the world around them seemed quieter, more hopeful. Whatever the future held, they would face it as a team, with no more fear, no more silence.